Good morning again, all. The only announcement I'll make right now is that for August's anti-reading or anti-racist reading group, we're going to be reading a book that may be interesting to some of you all. It's called Strangers in Their Own Land by a sociologist, Arlie Russell, who she's a sociologist who works in California, but she went and visited the bayous of Louisiana to investigate and write a really excellent qualitative report on the Tea Party movement in rural Louisiana. So it's a deep dive into sort of the culture of the people who helped to get President Trump elected in 2016. So we'll be reading that as a way of understanding what it means to be white-bodied, at least in Louisiana. So if anyone would like a copy of that book, and the reason I'm making the announcement is let me know and I can offer it to you at a discount. I'll be ordering copies from the bookshop in East Nashville. So if you let me know by this Friday, I'm happy to include you on that list, and it'll be $12, and you can pay us back either by cash check or using the WeShare app on the parish website.
Will you be doing this online again or virtually?
Yes, it'll still be on Zoom. And that meeting is set for August, it's the second Tuesday of August, August the 9th at 7 p.m. Sorry, that's August the 10th at 7 p.m. And then one other event, I suppose it would be helpful to note, in partnership with St. Vincent de Paul Parish on the north side, we are hosting an event called Six for Sainthood. This is a mutual gathering. It'll be here at Christ the King, where the topic of conversation will be the 6 African Americans who are lined up to be canonized in their various stages of the process. That will be on July 8th. It's a Thursday night, I believe. You can attend the 6 p.m. Mass if you wish, but we'll be meeting at 7 p.m. in the parish hall. A meal will be provided. And this is meant to be an introduction to one another, a two-parish meet and greet. This is an opportunity to meet folks from a parish that's fairly unlike ours, and have a conversation about things that we have in common, namely these 6 saints who are eagerly supporting and waiting on beatification. So that's July 8th at 7 p.m. If you haven't subscribed to our weekly mailing lists, you can do that on the parish website, ctk.org. That's the best way to stay abreast of everything that's going on in the parish. I tend to send out emails every Friday.
Is that meeting at the parish?
Correct. That will be in the parish hall.
Okay.
Okay. Welcome back, Victor Judge, for the 3rd of 4th sessions on Nella Larsen's passing. We're happy to have you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. This is
in
a very eventful weekend with the declaration of Juneteenth as an official holiday. It is also the commemoration of Father's Day, and also it is the summer solstice. So I'm delighted you're here as we consider again the novel Passing by Nella Larsen. I want to begin this session today by returning to a question that Maureen had asked at the conclusion of last week's class, which time did not permit me to address as comprehensively as I should like to. And her question to us was the significance of the character Gertrude, who appears in only one scene. It is the scene when she and Irene are taking tea with Claire, and Claire's husband enters into the scene and reveals himself for the unapologetic racist that he is. And Maureen had asked the question regarding the significance of Gertrude's character, which I'm happy to address at this interval. The scene in which Irene and Claire take tea with their childhood friend Gertrude demonstrates what might be described as the three women forming a socio-economic spectrum. Gertrude also is capable of passing. She, we learn, is married to a white butcher. Claire is also married to a white man. He is described rather vaguely as, and I quote, some sort of international banking agent, unquote, who, when younger, has, and I quote, turned up from South America with untold gold. We do not know how Claire's husband has actually acquired his fortune. Those details are kept rather vague, but Claire represents the upper end of the spectrum, whereas Gertrude, married to a butcher, would represent the lower end of the spectrum. And here we meet Irene, who is married to a medical doctor who himself is incapable of passing, who has never been to South America, but wants to immigrate to South America to escape the racist American society. Irene represents the center of this spectrum. And what is noteworthy in this scene with Gertrude is that Irene is quite annoyed with Gertrude's middle-class gaucheness, and with both Claire and Gertrude for being married to white men. And it's in this scene that inspires within Irene's interiority this admission that she makes to herself regarding becoming annoyed at this gathering. The narrator says that her annoyance arises from a feeling of being outnumbered, a sense of aloneness in her adherence to her own class and kind, not merely in the great thing of marriage, but in the whole pattern of her life as well. That phrase, the whole pattern of her life, is one which does indeed require our attention, because we know very little about the whole pattern of Irene's life. We do know that her father is a college graduate. Therefore, Irene probably grew up in a middle-class environment. Claire, we know, has envied Irene's economic status. Irene's own class and kind would seem to be middle-class African-American, whose rarity is implicit in Irene's sense of feeling alone. Irene would have less reason, relatively speaking, to be dissatisfied with her own childhood than Claire is with hers. Irene's relative satisfaction with her status would have created in her a strong race and class identity, which this passage that I just read reveals to us. Irene's position between the middle-class Gertrude and the upper-class Claire suggests that she too, as she thinks of Claire, wants to have her cake and eat it too, to live in an upper-class world that is Black. The Redfield's economic and social position allows Irene to participate in all of the activities comparably situated white women would enjoy. Activities such as charity work, bridge games. Irene wants Black emotional security and familiarity, and white financial security. She wants to play it safe, which is a rather symbolic example of which is that even when Claire's husband has returned from South America with untold gold, Irene refuses to let Brian seek riches there. So it's this maintenance of this sense of safety that is really, I think, analogous to a tightrope act that depends upon her husband, Brian, and his being the center of Irene's world. And she is very fearful that Claire will disrupt this balance that she has worked so very carefully to create and to sustain. I think also this scene with Gertrude, whose clothes are described as ill-fitting, and how she is indeed married to a white man of a position lesser than that of Claire's husband, of a financier of very vague circumstances, and Irene being married to a person of a respectable profession, medicine. This focus on class that we so much hear through the sensibility of Irene leads to us considering the cultural and the spiritual price that one has to pay in this act of passing. It's noteworthy also that only passers are invited to this tea. And in the discussion that they have prior to Ballou's entrance, they actually discuss an African-American who has passed over into the Jewish milieu, that he is no longer Negro, he is no longer Christian. And Claire seems quite aware of the cost of passing when she says to Irene, "Money's awfully nice to have. In fact, all things considered, I think, Reen, that it's worth even the price." And I think what's suggested here is that social class, and even having to, in losing one's spirituality, that there is this suggestion that when one passes and develops a different perspective, that it's a perspective that comes with the cost of being physically and mentally isolated from one's own native and one's own adopted culture. One is separated from one's native culture and has passed into an adopted culture, but one is always on this tightrope and is never completely assimilated. There is always this fear, if you will, of being expelled. This fear of expulsion, because before deciding to pass for white, Claire lived in an African-American identity, but not as Irene has lived as a member of the Black middle class. Claire has lived first as an impoverished daughter of an alcoholic custodian, and then she lives as the orphaned niece of two great white aunts who treat Claire as if she is Cinderella and they are the stepsisters. You know, Claire described for us, as we discussed last week, the upbringing and how it is quite commensurate with her great aunt's ideology, Aunt Grace and Aunt Edna, how their ideology and their attitude toward taking Claire in is directly from the slavery apologist of the Old South. The aunts echo this 19th century paternalist pro-slavery argument by pronouncing the curse of Ham upon Claire and assigning her to this subservient position in the family and intimating that moral degradation can only be addressed through hard work and white guidance, that what can correct the moral degradation of their brother. And what I find most noteworthy is they are willing to overlook the brother's transgression with a woman. What they cannot forgive the brother for is that the woman is African American. And so because of this act of moral degradation that has occurred in the family, the aunts believe that with hard work and white guidance, that they can direct Claire throughout her life. Claire confides to Irene that the economic and the psychological impact of her aunt's beliefs drive her eventually to discard her African-American identity and to pass for white. And she says this to Irene as she wanted things. And what she, I think, means by this in wanting things is not only material possessions, but love and emotional comfort. She does not want to be a person of charity. She does not want to be a problem, as her aunts refer to her. She does not want to be the daughter of the indiscreet Ham. And the aunts' definition of blackness and their view of blackness robs Claire of any notion of humanity. So she must shed this Black identity to be human. And to do so, she must turn white by passing and accept the demands of assimilation. Otherwise, she will experience what is known as the myth of expulsion. And this fear of being expelled. We are introduced, are we not, as readers, to this fear of expulsion in the very opening scene of the novel, the scene in which Claire and Irene re-encounter each other after 12 years of separation. This serves to initiate us very strategically into this phenomenon known as passing. When Irene initially escapes the searing heat of this August day in Chicago, and she enters the Drayton, there is, for us as readers, there is no hint, there is no intimation that what she is doing by entering the Drayton is that it's forbidden, that by ingressing into this white space only, we as readers have no intimation that she is entering into a forbidden space. It is only once when Irene becomes aware of another woman's gaze, of another woman's stare, that we learn that she is passing herself off as white. The other woman, Claire, continues to survey Irene, and this unwavering look forces Irene to wonder whether the other woman knows that, and I quote, "Here before her very eyes on the roof of the Drayton sat a Negro," unquote. Irene's fear of detection generates within her this inner monologue in which she admits that the other woman couldn't possibly know, and I emphasize here the verb know, could not possibly know she is a Negro. Never, Irene assures herself, has anyone remotely seemed to suspect that she is African American. People always have taken her for an Italian. a Spaniard, a Mexican, or a gypsy. But it's Claire's stare, this unwavering look, causes Irene to question her own attempt to pass as white. She is surprised by the possibility of being caught in the act of performing whiteness. For as she tells us that she has never been found out, this stare does not, however, cause her to question whether the languorous black eyes of the woman staring at her are part of a black and not a white body. Irene takes it for granted that the other woman is white. And even after Claire approaches her old acquaintance, and insists that she recognizes her, Irene asks herself, what white girls had she known well enough to have been familiarly addressed as Reen by them? Both Irene's admission,
I got it.
but both Irene's admission that she has never been questioned when passing, and her failure to register the possibility that the other woman, being something other than she seems, suggests to us, and this is what Larsen, I think, is accomplishing as a literary artist, that this suggests that race norms work through an assumption of whiteness. In a society in which white is recognized as the ideal or norm, one is assumed to be white unless one looks black. Looking black becomes a deviation from the normalized state of being white, and it's the invisibility of the mark of whiteness that is exactly the mark of its privilege. This assumption of whiteness is dramatically exposed when Irene first encounters Jack Ballou, Claire's racist husband. The Tea Party, in which Claire has invited Irene after their re-encounter, includes 3 women who pass: Claire, Irene, and Gertrude. Claire is the only one, however, who has completely passed over. And her husband claims to know an African American when he sees one. And he does not for one moment entertain the idea that one of the women sitting with his wife might be African American. And he feels quite secure, quite comfortable acknowledging that he doesn't dislike African Americans, he loathes them. It's not enough to say that he dislikes them. That is far, far, far too simple a word. He loathes them. He has nothing for them but unaffected scorn and unmitigated contempt, and refers to them as the scrimmy devils. Now, associating them with evil. So what this allows us to infer is that racial identity and classification, as dramatized here by Nella Larsen, suggest that such identity is constituted through skin color, the assumption of skin color. But what Larsen is showing us, what she is revealing to us, is that this category of race is much more complex. And these scenes bring to the foreground the contradiction at the heart of race definition in the United States. On the one hand, we have seen that race is assumed to manifest itself in the visible, in skin pigmentation. That is, that it operates on what might be described as this optical economy of identity, what one can see. But as Larsen makes it very clear to us in this text, the visible markings or lack thereof are not sufficient. They are not enough to tell the truth of race. After all, the three women at the Tea Party are not white. They are African American. And one of the most rudimentary lessons of passing that Larsen dramatizes for us is that the visible is never easily or simply a guarantor of the truth. And Irene herself is aware that optics are not enough to gauge race as it is defined in the United States. There is that moment when Irene avers and says, white people were so stupid about such things, for all they usually asserted that they were able to tell, and by the most ridiculous means, fingernails, palms of hand, shapes of ears, teeth, and other equally silly rot, unquote. Jack Ballou also articulates the contradiction. His pet name for his wife is one syllable of the racial epithet. It's most noteworthy that her name, Claire, means light, yet the pet name that her husband has adopted for her is merely one syllable of the racial epithet. And he tells Claire that she can become as dark complected as she wishes to be because he knows that she is not an African American. So once there is this assumption of whiteness, pigmentation does not signify in the same way. Melanin, the pigmentation of the hair, the skin, the iris of the eyes, it seems, is no longer the manifest truth of race, although you and I know that melanin has played a very crucial part in the construction of racial thinking in the United States. What Larsen perhaps is showing us is that since whiteness is recognized as privilege and the desirable color, or in other words, since there is only one ideal race, that subjects are immediately assumed to be white in the absence of any telling marks of color. But this novel makes it very clear to us, Beth, that race construction is much more than mere visibility, that the sense of sight is first and foremost an imperfect, flawed faculty, and one cannot know conclusively, definitively by a fallible faculty such as the senses. Questions or observations at this interval? I'm hopeful that I clarified Maureen's question about Gertrude's role, but also how Larsen is inviting us as readers of this novel to perhaps pass into, if you will, the contradiction of identity being completely circumscribed by what the eye can see or by a particular quantity of melanin. Questions or observations? Carol?
I was wondering if, now this may sound really weird, but if Nella's husband, they said, you said last time that he married a white woman.
Mhm.
Is it possible that Nella knew that this woman he married was not white?
No, she would have known because of her affiliation with Fisk University and her colleagues there. I will say this, Carol, I really think that if there is a character in this novel that is perhaps representative of Nella Larsen, that it's not, it's this merger of both Claire and Irene. I found out in my research since last week that Nella Larsen's mother did not even report her to the census, the year that the census was taken. And that we discussed how she sends her daughter here to Nashville to the Fisk Normal School, and the other daughter, a white child, doesn't even know that she has a sister. I think Larsen is very much reconstructing in Claire's childhood what she herself experienced as a young girl, not documented in the census, not recognized as being as existing, certainly. So I do think very much that if there is, Carol, in response to your question, a biographical element in the novel, if this can be read in any way as a document in Larsen's own biography, it is that she herself is biracial and that she herself knows what it is to be without immediate relatives. Other thoughts or questions? Does that answer your question, Carol?
Oh, I had some more thoughts on that, but I won't go into it.
I enjoyed this book so much that I'm actually reading Nella Larsen's first book, Quicksand, which is definitely a lot autobiographical, and there's some similar scenes and references in Quicksand that sort of elaborate on things we've saw in passing.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Kathy, that the title Quicksand, I think, is analogous in this novel to the figuration of the tightrope. In Quicksand, one is being pulled down by the effects of gravity. And if the fear of being drawn, the fear of falling, this figure of expulsion, being taken in by quicksand is a variation, I think, Kathy, on the whole idea of expulsion, if you will. Certainly. Well, let's consider this, if we may, in terms of this, what I described in my opening comments as this socioeconomic spectrum and this study in class. Claire is not a member of the rising Black bourgeoisie that Irene is a member of. Claire has never been a member of the aspiring middle class that Irene represents. She rises rapidly, she readily passes, and in so doing, in this passing from impoverishment into white financial security, it is, as I described last week, it's analogous to the ascent of Jay Gatsby in Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. In this rapid rising and passing, she has surpassed Irene in terms of class and material wealth. But in shifting her class status, what we have to say of Claire is this: she has, yes, passed. There is this shifting of status, but she has, in so passing and in shifting, she has maintained a clear sense of her prior identity. Yes, she has ascended into the upper echelon of white society, but that ascent is certainly one in which she remains mindful of racial sympathy. In her ascent to the upper echelon, she carries with her in that ascent what I would describe as a rather patriotic, not patronizing, but a patriotic racial sympathy. And as a result of taking that sympathy with her in her ascent, she's occupying a very precarious position. Throughout the novel, when Claire laughs, it's always described like an alarm. Her laugh is like a trill. It's like the ringing of bells. And she does incite outrage. She telephones incessantly. Characteristic of Claire's presence is the sounding of bells, either in her laugh or by the telephones. And perhaps it's noteworthy to consider how critics have described her ability to incite such frustration and outrage in another that she's comparable to a revolution. She's not always polite. She does not draw back and turn aside. She is not at all concerned that perhaps she is inspiring unsettledness on the part of others. She is described to us as dangerous, mysterious, furtive, seductive. She has the power to reduce Irene to reaction. And in many ways, what we now enter in this scene is more than just a meeting of two childhood acquaintances or a going to a tea party. What we really enter in this novel is a narrative in which there is played out a racial and class war between Irene and Claire. The spatial, the ideological positions that are held by Claire and Irene are revealed to us in several scenes in which they interact. And these scenes, these revolutionary scenes, if you will, occur in what seems to be the most civilized of places: tea rooms, parlors, boudoirs, ballrooms. But if you've read Virginia Woolf or Edith Wharton, or if you recall from our study of James Joyce's story from Dubliners, The Dead, we know that genteel settings can turn out to be the most brutal scenes where the most vicious and biting behavior, all conducted through manners, can occur. In chapter 2 of the very first section, in Encounter, it begins what Larsen has done in describing for us the actual intensity of the environment that becomes relocated, if you will, in the relationship of Claire and Irene. The novel begins for us so very ominously. The buildings shudder as if they are protesting the heat. There are these quivering lines springing up from the baked pavements. Automobiles are in a dancing blaze, and the glass of the shop windows throws out a blinding radiance. All of these properties of the physical landscape here very much suggest, do they not, a battle scene, the setting for a revolution. Sharp particles of dust rise from the burning sidewalks. these particles of dust sting the seared or dripping skins of wilting pedestrians. And what small breeze there is seems like the breath of a flame fanned by slow billows. As readers, we cannot underestimate the importance of these details, which are united by this complementary parallel of this intense energy waiting to explode. You know, it's a description of a scorching summer day in Chicago, but the language that we hear, Jim, is extremely violent. It is a very violent language. Buildings are shuddering in protest. The light dances in blazes. The light is a blinding radiance, rising particles, burning sidewalks. This suggests to us, does it not, a city under siege? And it very well may be that Larsen is in a way writing about the tumultuous race riots that had occurred 10 years before she will publish this novel, what was known as the Red Summer. It's the name given to that period in American history that covers the late winter, the spring, the summer, and the early autumn of the year 1919, because it is marked by hundreds of deaths and a large number of casualties from race riots that occur. The highest number of fatalities occurred in Elaine, Arkansas, but there were also casualties in Chicago and in Washington, D.C. as well. And so really what is being described here is more than just a hot day in August in Chicago. I think what Larsen has done is to draw this scene very specifically with very violent language, but really it becomes more than just one day on the annual calendar. It becomes the backdrop for this racial conflict that is developed between Irene and Claire. Irene is among the crowds who are fighting the Chicago heat. And characteristically of Irene, she is shopping for things to bring back from her visit, the inevitable material possessions which become necessary symbols of her social standing. And here is Irene navigating the intensity of this hostile environment, making her way through the Chicago streets in a land in which mechanical aeroplanes are readily available, but drawing books are very difficult to acquire. And as she is expressing her frustration of not being able to find the book that her younger son, Ted, wants, a man collapses in front of her. And at this moment, Irene edges her way out of the increasing crowd, feeling disagreeably damp and sticky from contact with so many perspiring bodies. Her desire to distance herself from the sweating masses is evidence, perhaps, of her distaste for the working classes represented on the streets of Chicago. She feels, the narrator says to us, a need for immediate safety. And feeling herself faint, she hails a taxi. And a very remarkable exchange occurs for you and me as readers in the blank margin of our book, in that moment between Irene's statement to the taxi driver that she hails, that she might benefit from some tea. And his suggestion is that she go to the Drayton Hotel. Now consider what happens in the margin of our books on that page. When she hails the taxi and says that perhaps what she needs is the benefit of some tea, the driver suggests she goes to the Drayton, a white space. And Irene does not in any way direct him to another venue. It's in that moment that Irene passes, and neither the omniscient narrator nor Irene comment upon what would be considered by white society as a transgression. Now, the event occurs on the blank margin of the page. And what that allows us to infer, Mary Lou, is that it is so natural for Irene to pass that she's not even conscious that she is doing so. And astonishingly, during the cab ride, she simply, and I quote, makes some small attempts to repair the damage that the heat and the crowds had done to her appearance. And then blissfully, she enters the Drayton Hotel. Irene's omission in the scene, her not directing the taxi driver to another venue, allows us to infer that she is quite comfortable with such an act of passing, with such a transgression. The narrator says that Irene feels as if she is being wafted upwards on a magic carpet to another world, pleasant, quiet, and strangely remote from the sizzling one that she has left below, unquote. She sequesters herself on the rooftop of an ivory tower, and she surveys the specks of cars and people creeping about in the streets below. And from this vantage point that she now enjoys, she comments about how very silly they look. Claire Kendry will come into this space. She will occupy the same space in the text, but she never looks askance at those below. And so the text reveals to us that this distancing, this constant need to move away from and above, is very much characteristic of the kinetics of Irene. I find it very interesting, and we see the significance of this gesture after we realize what Larsen has actually written in the blank margin of the pages of this scene. And that is that when Irene does ascend the rooftop, she is very careful to locate herself at a distance where no one can get behind her. I find it very interesting that she describes the kinetics of Claire being like a cat, but in a way, Irene also adopts the posture of a cat, securing oneself whereby nothing can get behind one, where one is able to gaze out upon all. And the pleasant quiet of the Drayton turns out to be, like all restricted white-only islands in the white hegemony, only a temporary sanctuary. The rank air is broken by motion, commotion, fluidity, and ferocity in the form of Claire Kendry as she makes her entrance. Claire collapses the distance between Irene and the masses. as well as collapsing the distance between Irene's African heritage and her desire to be white. And the novel is devoted to realizing Irene's desire not to be the link between Claire and her poor dark brethren. That is how Claire sees Irene. She sees her very much like the hyphen in African American as before 2019. She sees her as this link to the dark brethren. But because such a position will interfere with Irene's view of herself as a private American citizen, Claire's ability to accomplish this feat is dependent upon her unique position as a Black woman who can wear the mask of mimicry. Quite literally, Claire is described as looking like a beautiful white woman. But at the same time, unmask the performative nature of such a dominant identity. Claire has passed, but she has passed with an altogether different sensibility than does Irene. Wearing the mask that Claire has put on when she turns 18 years old. But even though she is donning this mask, as I said in my earlier comment, beneath the mask, there is still this desire on her part to try to connect to her real heritage. She uses her ivory mask, wearing the pale caste, as a decoy to distract her adversaries. And that allows her to infiltrate hostile territory. She's never completely comfortable in white society. Comments or questions at this interval?
Victor, I just find that really interesting. You're saying she's never really comfortable, and yet she's, coloration wise, she is even more pale than now I'm blanking on Irene's name. But Irene can take refuge at times in her own Black community. Yeah. Claire never can. She always has to be something that's not completely her.
Which suggests to us, does it not, Beth, that she is performing race, that her entire life, I think it's noteworthy, Beth, that her face is described, the description that is given of Claire, she always had that pale gold hair. The ivory skin had a peculiar soft luster, and the eyes were magnificent, dark, sometimes absolutely black, always luminous, arresting eyes, slow and mesmeric with all their warmth, something withdrawn and secret about them. Oh, surely they were Negro eyes, mysterious and concealing, and set in that ivory face under that bright hair. There was about them something exotic, unquote. What this suggests to us is it not, Beth, that in passing, she is, and her face being described as a mask. I tend to think, Beth, of the classical theater of ancient Greece in which the actors, in playing different parts, wore different masks, either the mask of comedy or the mask of tragedy, but the donning of masks to play a part. When we think about Irene's life, it has been, has it not, Beth, a continual drama of different acts. I mean, I think the opening scene when we first meet her and she makes her entrance on the stage, it is an extremely dramatic, forceful entrance. She always has this incredible entrance in each of the scenes in which we see her with Irene, in whether it's in the tea room or whether it's even in the kitchen. And the idea, Beth, of having to perform for an audience who are looking upon her with their gaze and with their expectations of how she must conduct herself. The early actors in the Greek theater, Beth, were referred to as the Hippocrates. They were the followers of Hippocrates, one of the early fathers of drama. And today, when we refer to a hypocrite, it's one who wears a mask or plays a different role. And in what we could argue, Beth, is that Claire's entire life has been one in which she has to perform. She has, in the absence of a maternal figure, having to perform for others, having to perform the role of the good girl in response to her father's drunkenness, having to perform the role of servant for Aunt Edna and Aunt Grace, and then having to perform in this marriage. We can only imagine the expenditure of energy that is required to conduct one's life in such a way. Does that make sense, Beth?
It does. And I just think Irene is so interesting, though, because she seems so envious of what Claire has and her looks and everything. And yet she gets to retreat sometimes. She too has to put on the mask when she goes to the Drayton, or, or even a different mask when she's, putting the ball together and everything to perform for the white people that love her community and seem to, but she gets to relax. But as I say that, I even wonder that because of her relationship with her husband. And so I really don't know. Maybe they are just all wearing masks all the time, performing for somebody in a different way, but it's constant, like moving. Who am I really trying to relate to now, and how do they want to see me, and how can I fulfill that?
Exactly. It's whenever one makes an entrance, there is a stage, and one enters on that of having to fulfill certain expectations of those gazing upon them. Your point about Irene, yes, I think what we have to establish, Beth, is that in this novel, we have two protagonists. And Irene also wearing the mask. She in the Drayton has to put on a mask, and it's the gaze of another woman whom she does not initially know. Coming under the scrutiny of that gaze, she becomes very self-conscious. And yet she has to put on the mask when she recruits funding for the different charity balls of which she is helping to sponsor. And she doesn't want Claire to come onto that stage for fear that will perhaps have an effect upon her sense of place as well. I have I have compassion for Irene as well in this narrative, Beth, because her life is also one of constantly having to perform a role. She is a member of the African-American rising bourgeoisie, and she wants to sustain that. But going back to your point earlier, I think Claire becomes for her this visual, this physical embodiment of what she really would desire, which is white financial standing. Irene has achieved that, and she didn't have to pass through the bourgeoisie to get it. She has acquired it, and when she looks upon Claire, it's as if this is the embodiment of what she really desires. And it's as if she's climbing the rung of the ladder. And there's this constant fear that she's going to fall, like falling off the tightrope. Consider this. She wants to keep her home, what I would describe as a very antiseptic environment. The antithesis of the environment in which we are first brought in as readers, when bodies are perspiring and sweating and fainting. And she herself is beginning to feel as if she is becoming faint, but she doesn't want to assume that fallen posture of the masses. And she wants to send her son to boarding school in Europe. She does not want her husband, Brian, to talk to the older son about matters of sexuality, and she fears that he is moving too fast. And that's her euphemism. And again, you know, Irene's lexicon is one that has euphemisms as well. Instead of talking directly and specifically about her son's development, she wants her husband not to talk to him about it. You know, and her son is hearing things in jokes. And Brian thinks that the whole idea of sexuality ultimately is one great joke. And Irene is very resistant to her husband's view. She doesn't want him to go to Brazil. That would completely disrupt this order that she is trying to preserve and to navigate. And it's, I mean, the way, when I look at the way Irene has to move, it's physically exhausting. If you were to imagine this being performed on the stage, she's never really still. There's always an anxiety accompanying her. And with the arrival of Claire, it's as if Claire unashamedly, unapologetically trespasses into this order that Irene is so carefully trying to maintain. And it's this fear, I think, Beth, of becoming displaced. But I think as a charitable reader, what that requires of us is to really look at all of the energy that Claire and Irene are having to expend in sustaining an image of a particular social location. And that energy, you and I, Beth, know, is one that could perhaps be used in a much more constructive, creative way. This is simply an energy that is it not, Maureen, being expended to maintain stasis, to maintain fixity. And that it's not an energy that is regenerative. It's not an energy by which one becomes renewed. It is an energy ultimately that depletes one. And so I think as charitable readers, as I know us to be, that is how we look upon this narrative. Other questions or comments? Did that answer the question satisfactorily? Yeah, it is. And I think ultimately, when we look at their lives as performance, I think Larsen is saying this about race altogether, that the white construction of race is one that requires a performance as opposed to a being of one's selfhood. And that's not healthy. Maureen?
It just struck me from what you've just been describing that Irene and Claire both want what each other has, what the other person has. Claire wants to live in her world of origin, wants to connect to her roots, so to speak, and but be arrived like Irene theoretically has financially with the status of the community, but it isn't quite there for Irene because she still wants that recognition that you can only get at that time, and even now in the white world.
Precisely.
Even though she's married to a successful professional,
Mhm.
but she still has to worry about being discovered in the white hotel. So they both are unhappy for, you know, different reasons, I guess.
Yeah, it is it not, Maureen, a perpetual act of masking, of having to put on the appropriate garment. I think that's one of the reasons that that Irene is so unnerved by what she perceives in Gertrude as a ghostess, because she is not properly attired for the role of T. When Claire comes unannounced, when Claire actually comes into Irene's carefully manicured place, when Irene has refused to take her calls, and then very boldly, like in this act of like usurpation, or thinking of her again as a revolutionary figure, she simply comes into the space unapologetically, unannounced, and goes into the boudoir. And Irene's first gesture is to get up and powder her face, put on her mask before receiving the beautiful Claire. And I think there's something to be said there, Maureen, that even in this space, which she has so carefully tried to construct and maintain and to create these borders, this insular existence that will not in any way include Brazil, that in this insular realm that she has created, that she's even made uncomfortable in her own setting. She can be made uncomfortable in her own space by the presence of Claire, which I think becomes indicative of just how very precarious her place is. Does that support what you were thinking, Maureen? I think Maureen's. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, now we can. Yes. Other questions or observations?
Victor, I'm struck by the amount of, I think you're telling of the amount of energy that Irene has put into maintaining everything in its right place. And, you know, imagining that maybe if she got her husband to take her son to school, that it would distract him from, you know, South America or Brazil or wherever he wants to go. And, you know, trying to manage everybody's life.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get any real sense. I mean, it's hard to get a real sense of what's her life other than managing everybody's to keep her feeling okay, but she doesn't really feel okay because she's so anxious in trying to manipulate and hold it all together.
Right.
So I just want to say thank you, because I really struggled with that in the reading.
Yeah. Well, the advantage, Mary Lou, of her son going to boarding school in a European institution of learning, certainly it would be a very strong, rigorous academic tradition, but I'm not so certain that, again, she doesn't explain why she wants Brian to take Junior to Europe for a school. I think in part it's a safe inference to make. He'll be exposed to whiteness. He will be exposed to European whiteness. He will be exposed to a very old tradition that you know, from which the American tradition has developed. It's as if he will be exposed to the mother tongue and to the mother country, to the greater continent, the older continent. And as is it, and again, what we have to consider is, Mary Lou, is that with his going there, with his being African-American and matriculating in a European boarding school, he's going to have to perform. So it's as if her children are becoming the next generation of performers, if you will.
Like herself.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes,
To keep the myth alive.
yes. And to keep it so very antiseptically clean, if you will. Irene, your question or a comment, please.
Just a comment, and I know right now we're looking at the whole issue of passing in terms of race, but I just kept thinking about, or keep thinking about, how all of us struggle with masks, having to impress somebody in some way, that if it's just to cover up our own fears or whatever, we're all struggling at times anyway with masks.
Yes. I think, Irene, of that wonderful line from our first modern poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. There will be time, indeed there will be time, to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet.
Yeah. I know that. Experientially.
Yeah. Well, we are, as usual, we're past the designated hour, John. Thank you for letting us stay on until this time. In next week's class, we will look at the third act of this drama, if you will, the finale. And what we will discover is that just as Larsen, as a writer, is inviting us to look at the ambiguities in the construction of race, she very much writes for us a very ambiguous finale. And I think it is that she wants us to become displaced by the ambiguity, whereby we can enter into an examination, an interrogation of what we think we know by virtue of what we see. Thank you all immensely.
Thank you, Victor.
John, comments?
No, I think we're good.
Thank you all for attending. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
Goodbye.